The auction yard stank of sweat, manure, and desperation. Caleb Rourke stood at the edge of the crowd, hat pulled low, hands shoved deep in his coat pockets. He wasn't here to socialize, wasn't here to make friends or shake hands with men who'd sold him bad cattle 3 years running. He was here for one thing, a reliable mare. Something steady, something that wouldn't spook at shadows or throw him when the wind picked up wrong. The auctioneer's voice cut through the afternoon heat like a rusty saw, sharp, grating, relentless. Lot 17, fine sorrel, 6 years old, broke to saddle and plow both. Do I hear 15? Caleb watched the horse circle the pen. Too skittish, eyes rolling white. He'd seen that look before, an animal that had been beaten into submission but never actually broken properly. Give it a month and it'd either go lame or bolt with a rider on its back. He turned to leave. That's when he saw her. At first she was just a shape, small, thin, hunched against the fence post like she was trying to disappear into the wood itself. Barefoot, dress torn and faded to the color of old bone, rope tied around her wrist, the other end held loosely by a man Caleb vaguely recognized from the saloon. Pete Garrison, a drunk who'd lost his farm 2 seasons back and had been drifting ever since. Caleb stopped walking. The girl didn't move, didn't look up. Just stood there, shoulders curved inward, hair hanging in her face like a curtain she could hide behind. Pete saw him staring and grinned, a wet, ugly thing that showed too many gaps where teeth used to be. "You interested, Rourke?" he called out, loud enough that a few heads turned. "Got myself a real bargain here. Found her wandering the flats 3 days ago. Ain't said a word since. Figure she's simple, but she can work. Strong hands, see?" He yanked the rope. The girl stumbled forward but didn't cry out. Didn't even flinch. Just caught her balance and went still again. Something cold settled in Caleb's gut. "I'm looking for a horse," he said flatly. Pete laughed, a wheezing, phlegmy sound. "Hell, horses cost money. This one here? I'll take $5 and call it charity." $5. The same price as a broken plow or a week's worth of grain. Caleb should have kept walking, should have found his horse, paid his money, and ridden back to the valley where he belonged, alone. Like always. But the girl lifted her head, just slightly, just enough, and her eyes met his. They weren't empty. That's what got him. He'd expected vacancy, the dull glaze of someone beaten down past caring, but her eyes were sharp, watchful, like she was measuring him, weighing him, seeing something he didn't even know was there. It unsettled him in a way he couldn't name. "She got a name?" Caleb heard himself ask. Pete shrugged. "Didn't ask. Don't matter much, does it?" The auctioneer had moved on to the next lot. A few men lingered near the pen, eyeing the girl with the kind of casual cruelty that came easy in a place like this. One of them, a rancher named Hewitt, spat tobacco juice into the dust and grinned. "Hell, Pete, you ought to just turn her loose. Let the wolves have her. Save someone the trouble." Laughter rippled through the small crowd. Caleb's jaw tightened. He didn't know why it bothered him. People got bought and sold out here all the time, indentured labor, mail-order brides, orphans handed off to whoever would feed them. It wasn't pretty, but it was how things worked. You survived however you could, and sentiment didn't factor into it. Still, that look in her eyes. Like she already knew what he was going to do before he did. $10, Caleb said. The laughter stopped. Pete blinked, clearly not expecting anyone to actually bid. "You serious?" $10, Caleb repeated. "Take it or don't." Pete's grin returned, sharper this time. "Shit, Rourke, didn't know you were in the market for, do we have a deal or not?" The drunk's grin faltered. He glanced at the girl, then back at Caleb, clearly trying to figure out if he could squeeze more money out of this. But Caleb's expression didn't shift, didn't soften. He just stood there, waiting, and something about the stillness of it made Pete nervous. "Yeah," Pete said finally. "Yeah, we got a deal." Caleb counted out the money, 10 worn bills that felt heavier than they should have. Pete snatched them up, untied the rope from his own belt, and tossed it toward Caleb like he was handing off a dog. "She's all yours. Good luck with her." Then he was gone, slipping into the crowd before Caleb could change his mind. Caleb stood there holding the rope, staring down at the frayed end of it. The girl hadn't moved, hadn't said a word. Just stood there, barefoot in the dust, watching him with those 2 sharp eyes. He cleared his throat. "You got a name?" Silence. Can you talk? Nothing. He sighed, coiling the rope in his hand. All right. Come on then. He turned and started walking toward where his wagon was hitched. After a moment, he heard the soft scuff of bare feet following behind him. The ride back to the ranch took 3 hours. Caleb didn't talk, didn't see the point. The girl sat in the back of the wagon, knees pulled up to her chest, staring out at the endless stretch of scrubland and sky. She didn't ask where they were going, didn't ask what he wanted with her, just sat there, silent as stone. It gave him too much time to think. What the hell was he doing? He didn't need help, didn't want company. His ranch ran fine with just him, had for the last 8 years since his father died, and left him the land. It wasn't much. 100 acres of stubborn earth, a herd of cattle that barely kept him solvent, a house that leaked when it rained and creaked when the wind blew. But it was his. And it was quiet. Now he'd gone and bought a girl he didn't need with money he couldn't afford to waste. Stupid. But every time he glanced back at her, sitting there in the wagon bed with her arms wrapped around her knees, he couldn't quite regret it. She looked like she was used to being forgotten, like she expected it. And something about that made his chest tighten in a way he didn't like. The sun was sinking low by the time they reached the ranch. The house sat at the end of a long dirt road, squat and weathered, with a barn that leaned slightly to the left, and a chicken coop that hadn't seen paint in a decade. It wasn't much to look at, but it was functional. That's all Caleb cared about. He pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down. The girl didn't move. "This is it," he said, gesturing vaguely at the house. "Not fancy, but it's dry. Mostly." She slid out of the wagon bed without a sound, landing lightly on her bare feet. She looked around, taking in the house, the barn, the empty expanse of land stretching out in every direction. Caleb waited for some kind of reaction. Fear, relief, anything. But her face stayed blank. "You hungry?" he asked. No response. He sighed and headed toward the house. "Come on." Inside, the house was dim and spare. A single room with a fireplace on one end, a rough-hewn table in the middle, and a bed shoved against the far wall. Caleb didn't have much in the way of furniture. Didn't need it. He lit a lamp, then rummaged through his meager pantry. Cornmeal, dried beans, a bit of salted pork. Not much, but enough. "Sit," he said, nodding toward the table. The girl hesitated, then lowered herself onto the bench. She folded her hands in her lap and waited. Caleb started a fire, put a pot of water on to boil, and began slicing the pork. The silence stretched between them, heavy and awkward. He wasn't used to having someone else in his space, wasn't used to the weight of another person's presence. "You got a name or not?" he asked again, not looking at her. Silence. He glanced over his shoulder. She was staring at the fire, her face half lit by the flickering light. For a moment, he thought she wasn't going to answer. Then she moved. Slowly, deliberately, she reached out and touched the table. Her finger traced a shape in the dust there, a curve, a line. Another curve. Letters. L-I-O-R-A. Caleb frowned. "Liora?" She nodded once. "You can't talk, but you can write?" Another nod. He turned back to the stove, processing that. "All right, Leora it is." He finished cooking in silence, ladled the thin stew into 2 bowls, and set one in front of her. She stared at it like she didn't quite believe it was real. "Eat," he said. She picked up the spoon, slowly, carefully, and took a small bite. Then another. Then she ate like someone who hadn't had a real meal in weeks, which Caleb realized she probably hadn't. He watched her for a moment, then sat down across from her with his own bowl. They ate in silence. That night, Caleb gave her the bed and took the floor. It wasn't chivalry. He just didn't know what else to do with her. She was thin enough that the wind could probably knock her over, and she looked half dead on her feet. He wasn't about to make her sleep on the ground. He rolled out a blanket near the fireplace, lay down, and stared at the ceiling. This was temporary, he told himself. He'd figure out what to do with her in the morning. Maybe there was a family in town that needed help. Maybe she had people looking for her. Maybe. But even as he thought it, he knew it wasn't true. Nobody looked for girls like her. Nobody cared. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep. He woke to the smell of coffee. Caleb sat up, disoriented. The fire had been stoked. The pot was on. And Leora was standing at the stove, barefoot and silent, stirring something in a pan. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice rough with sleep. She glanced at him, then went back to cooking. Caleb stood, rubbing his face. "You don't have to." She set a plate on the table, eggs, fried cornmeal, a slice of the salted pork. He stared at it. "Where'd you find the eggs?" She pointed toward the door. "You went outside?" A nod. Caleb looked at the plate, then at her, then back at the plate. He didn't know what to say, so he sat down and ate. It was good, better than anything he'd cooked in months. When he finished, he stood and grabbed his hat. "I've got work to do. Cattle need checking. Fence needs mending. You can, I don't know, stay here, rest, whatever." She watched him, unblinking. He hesitated at the door. "You don't have to work, Leora. You're not. I didn't buy you to." He stopped, frustrated. "Just don't run off, all right?" She tilted her head slightly, like she was considering it. Then she nodded. Caleb left before he could say anything else stupid. Quick. He spent the morning riding the fence line, checking for breaks and fixing what he could. The work was mindless, which was good. It gave him time to think, or not think, which was better. By the time he rode back toward the house, the sun was high and unforgiving. He dismounted near the barn, intending to water the horse and maybe grab something to eat. That's when he heard it. A low, guttural sound. Caleb froze. It was coming from the barn. He moved quickly, quietly, hand instinctively going to the knife at his belt. He pushed the barn door open and stopped. Leora was kneeling in the straw beside one of his cows. The animal was on its side, breathing hard, eyes rolling. Caleb recognized the signs immediately. Labor. And it wasn't going well. "Damn it," he muttered, moving forward. She wasn't supposed to calve for another week. Leora looked up at him, then back at the cow. She placed her hand on the animal's flank, her expression calm, focused. Caleb crouched beside her. "She's in trouble. Calf's probably breech. I'll need to..." Leora shook her head. "What do you mean, no? I've done this before, I can..." She placed her other hand on his chest. Not pushing, just stopping him. Her eyes locked onto his, and for a moment Caleb forgot how to breathe. It wasn't just the intensity of her gaze. It was the certainty in it. Like she knew something he didn't. Like she could see something he couldn't. "Leora." She turned back to the cow and began to hum. It was soft, barely audible. A low, rhythmic sound that seemed to vibrate through the air itself. The cow's breathing slowed. Caleb watched, frozen, as Leora moved her hands along the animal's side, pressing gently here, pausing there. Her humming never stopped, and slowly, impossibly, the cow began to calm. 15 minutes later, the calf slid free, alive, healthy, already trying to stand on wobbly legs. Caleb stared. "How did you..." Leora stood, brushing straw from her dress. She didn't look at him, just walked past him, out of the barn, and back toward the house. Caleb stayed where he was, kneeling in the straw, staring at the newborn calf. His hands were shaking. That night, he didn't ask her about it. Didn't know how. They ate in silence again, another meal she'd somehow pulled together from almost nothing. When they finished, Caleb cleared his throat. "Thank you," he said. "For the cow. I don't know what you did, but thank you." She nodded. He hesitated, then added, "You don't have to stay, you know. If you want to leave, go somewhere else. I won't stop you." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she stood, walked to the fireplace, and sat down on the floor beside it. She pulled her knees to her chest and rested her chin on them, staring into the flames. Caleb watched her. "You're staying, then?" She didn't move. But something in the set of her shoulders told him the answer. He nodded slowly. "All right, back." The days that followed fell into a strange rhythm. Caleb would wake to find coffee already made, the fire stoked, breakfast waiting. He'd go out to work the land, and when he came back, things would be different. Not wrong, just different. The chickens were laying more eggs. The vegetable garden he'd let go to weeds was suddenly thriving. The tools he'd left scattered around the barn were organized, cleaned, sharpened. And Leora was always there, silent, watchful, moving through the space like a ghost. But it was more than that. She knew things. Like the day Caleb was about to ride out to check the north pasture, and she grabbed his arm, shook her head firmly. "What?" he asked. She pointed west. "The north pasture is that way," he said, pointing. She shook her head again and pointed west. Caleb sighed but humored her. He rode west instead. An hour later, he found 3 of his cattle tangled in a ravine they had no business being near. If he hadn't found them when he did, they'd have died there. When he got back, Leora was hanging laundry. She didn't say anything, didn't even look at him, but she'd known. Somehow, she'd known. 2 weeks in, Caleb stopped pretending he understood what was happening. He just accepted it, accepted her. She still didn't talk, barely wrote. But she didn't need to. She had other ways of communicating, small gestures, the tilt of her head, the way she'd touch his hand when he was about to make a mistake. And slowly, without meaning to, Caleb started to rely on it, on her. One evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Caleb found himself talking. Not because he expected an answer, just because the silence felt less heavy with her there. "My father built this place," he said, staring into the flames. "Took him 20 years. He was hard. Didn't believe in softness. Said it got you killed out here." Leora was sitting across from him, knees pulled up, listening. "He died alone," Caleb continued. "Heart gave out while he was fixing a fence. I found him the next morning. He'd been lying there all night." He paused, jaw tight. "I used to think he was right, that staying alone was safer, easier." Leora tilted her head slightly. Caleb looked at her. "But you're here now, and I don't know what that means." She stood and crossed the room, knelt beside him, and then slowly she placed her hand over his heart, not pushing, just resting there. Caleb's breath caught, because in that moment he felt it. Not words, not thoughts, but understanding. Like she was reaching past everything he said and touching the part of him he kept buried, the part that was tired, lonely, afraid. His throat tightened. "How do you do that?" he whispered. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. It was a month before the first real problem surfaced. Caleb had ridden into town for supplies, flour, salt, nails, basic things. Leora had stayed behind, which was fine. He didn't like bringing her into town anyway. Too many eyes, too many questions. But when he walked into the general store, he immediately felt the shift. The conversation stopped. People stared. Caleb ignored it and headed to the counter where the shopkeeper, a man named Guthrie, was waiting. "Rourke," Guthrie said, his tone careful. "Heard you got yourself some help out at the ranch." Caleb didn't look up. "That's right. Quiet girl, they say. Don't talk." "She works hard." Guthrie leaned forward slightly. "Where'd she come from?" "Does it matter?" "Folks are curious is all." Caleb finally met his eyes. "Then folks should mind their business." Guthrie's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Just concerned, Rourke. You know how people talk." "Let them." Caleb paid for his supplies and left, but he felt their eyes on him the whole way out. When he got back to the ranch, Leora was in the garden, pulling weeds. She looked up when he approached, and for a moment he thought about telling her what happened. But what was there to say? That the town was already starting to talk? That they were afraid of her without even knowing her? Instead, he just nodded. "Everything all right here?" She nodded back. "Good." He carried the supplies inside and tried to forget the look in Guthrie's eyes. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was starting, something he couldn't stop. That night, a storm rolled in. It came fast. No warning, no thunder, just wind and rain that hit like a wall. Caleb was inside, securing the windows, when Leora suddenly grabbed his arm. Her grip was tight, urgent. "What?" he asked. She pulled him toward the door. "Leora, it's pouring out there." She yanked harder, her eyes wide. And then Caleb heard it, a sound like the world splitting open. He grabbed the lantern and followed her outside, rain soaking through his clothes instantly. She led him toward the barn, moving fast, and he barely had time to process what was happening before, crack, A bolt of lightning struck the oak tree at the edge of the property, the one Caleb had been standing under just 10 minutes earlier, checking the horses. The tree exploded, wood and fire and smoke. Caleb stared, heart hammering in his chest. If he'd still been there. He turned to Leora, who was standing beside him, drenched and shaking. "How did you know?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the rain. She didn't answer, just looked at him with those sharp, knowing eyes. And Caleb realized something that made his blood run cold. She hadn't heard the storm coming. She'd felt it, seen it, known it, before it even happened. Matikik. The rain didn't let up until dawn. Caleb spent most of the night awake, sitting by the window, watching water pour off the roof in sheets. The lightning had stopped, but the wind kept howling, rattling the shutters like it was trying to get inside. Leora had gone to bed without a word, same as always. But Caleb couldn't shake the image of her standing in the rain, soaked to the bone, staring at him with those eyes that saw too much. She'd known. Somehow, she'd known exactly when that tree would get hit. Not a guess. Not luck. She'd pulled him away seconds before it happened, like she'd watched it play out already in her mind. Caleb had seen a lot of strange things in his life. Animals acting odd before earthquakes. Old-timers who could smell snow coming 3 days out. His own father used to claim he could tell when a man was lying just by the way he breathed. But this was different. This wasn't instinct. This was something else entirely. When the sun finally came up, weak and pale through the clouds, Caleb stepped outside to survey the damage. The oak tree was a blackened skeleton now, split right down the middle. Smoke still rose from the charred wood, mixing with the morning mist. He walked over to it, boots squelching in the mud, and stood where he'd been standing the night before, right where the lightning had struck. If Leora hadn't pulled him away. He didn't finish the thought. Behind him, the door creaked open. He turned to see Leora standing on the porch, wrapped in one of his old blankets, watching him. "You saved my life," he said quietly. She didn't react, just stood there, barefoot on the wet wood, her hair still damp from the rain. Caleb walked back toward the house, stopping at the bottom of the steps. "How did you know it was coming?" Silence. He wasn't expecting an answer, didn't even know why he asked. But something in him needed to say it out loud, needed to acknowledge what had happened. "I don't understand you," he said, more to himself than to her, "but I'm starting to think that's the point." Leora tilted her head slightly, studying him. Then she turned and went back inside. Caleb stood there a moment longer, staring at the ruined tree, before following her in. Over the next few days, things settled back into their rhythm. Caleb worked the land. Leora worked the house. Neither of them talked about the storm, but Caleb found himself watching her more closely now. The way she'd pause in the middle of hanging laundry and turn her head toward the horizon, like she was listening to something he couldn't hear. The way she'd avoid certain parts of the property for no reason he could figure out, until he'd find a snake den or a weak board or some other hazard he would have walked right into. She wasn't just observant, she was aware of everything, and it scared him more than he wanted to admit. One afternoon, Caleb was shoeing one of the horses when Leora appeared in the barn doorway. She stood there watching him work, her expression unreadable. "Need something?" he asked, not looking up. She walked over and knelt beside him, reaching out to touch the horse's leg. "Hey, careful, he doesn't like—" But the horse didn't flinch, didn't even shift its weight, just stood there, calm as anything, while Leora ran her hand along its flank. Caleb frowned. "That's the same horse that kicked me last week." Leora glanced at him, then back at the animal. She pressed her palm flat against its side, just above the ribs, and closed her eyes. The horse let out a low breath and leaned into her touch. "What are you doing?" Caleb asked. She didn't answer, just stayed like that for another minute, her hand on the horse, her breathing slow and even. Then she stood and walked out of the barn. Caleb stared after her, then looked back at the horse. It was standing perfectly still now, head lowered, eyes half closed, calm in a way it never was. "What the hell?" Caleb muttered. He finished the shoeing in silence, but the whole time he couldn't stop thinking about the way the animal had reacted to her. Like she'd done something, said something, without ever opening her mouth. Eyes. A week later, Caleb had to make another trip into town. He'd been putting it off. Didn't like the way people had looked at him last time, didn't like the questions. But he was out of flour and coffee, and the fence on the south pasture needed wire he didn't have, so he hitched up the wagon and headed out, leaving Leora behind with strict instructions to stay close to the house. She nodded, same as always, but Caleb had the distinct feeling she wasn't going to listen. The ride into town was uneventful. The sky was clear, the road dry. By the time he reached the main street, the sun was high and hot, baking the dirt until it cracked. Caleb parked the wagon outside the general store and went inside. Guthrie was behind the counter again, but this time he wasn't alone. 2 other men stood near the back. Ranchers Caleb recognized but didn't know well. They stopped talking when he walked in. "Rourke," Guthrie said, his tone careful again. "Back so soon. Need supplies." "Of course," Guthrie pulled out a ledger. "What can I get you?" Caleb rattled off his list, keeping his voice flat and his eyes on the counter. He could feel the other men watching him, could feel the weight of their stares. One of them, a man named Coulter, cleared his throat. "Heard you got that girl out at your place." Caleb didn't look up. "That's right. Strange one, they say. She works hard. Don't talk, though. That true?" "She doesn't need to." Coulter stepped closer. He was a big man, broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by too much sun and too much whiskey. "My wife saw her in town a few weeks back, said she looked off, like something wasn't right with her." Caleb finally looked up. "Your wife says a lot of things." Coulter's jaw tightened. "You calling my wife a liar?" "I'm saying she doesn't know what she's talking about." The tension in the room thickened. Guthrie shifted uncomfortably behind the counter, but he didn't say anything. The other man, a younger rancher named Boone, spoke up. "People are just concerned, Rourke. Girl like that, showing up out of nowhere? It raises questions. Then they can keep their questions to themselves. Can't do that if she's causing problems." Caleb's hands curled into fists. "She's not causing problems." "Not yet," Coulter said. "But folks don't like mysteries. And that girl? She's a mystery." Caleb grabbed his supplies and dropped money on the counter. "We done here?" Guthrie counted the bills quickly. "Yeah, you're good." Caleb turned to leave, but Coulter stepped into his path. "Just a warning, Rourke. People around here don't take kindly to things they don't understand. You do well to remember that." Caleb met his eyes. "And you do well to remember that what happens on my land is my business, not yours." He pushed past Coulter and walked out. But as he climbed into the wagon and snapped the reins, he felt it again, that same prickling unease. The town was talking, and talk had a way of turning into something worse. Mount. When Caleb got back to the ranch, Leora was sitting on the porch steps, a basket of herbs beside her. He climbed down from the wagon and started unloading supplies. "Told you to stay inside." She didn't move. "Leora." She looked up at him, her expression calm. Then she stood and picked up the basket, carrying it inside without a word. Caleb sighed and followed her. Inside, she was already sorting the herbs, laying them out on the table in neat rows. Some he recognized, others he didn't. "Where'd you get those?" he asked. She pointed toward the hills. "You went all the way out there?" A nod. Caleb rubbed his face. "You can't just wander off like that. It's not safe." She gave him a look, one that said she knew exactly how safe it was. Safer than he did, probably. "Fine," he muttered. "What are they for?" She picked up one of the plants, a thin, leafy thing with small white flowers, and held it out to him. "I don't know what that is." She touched his chest, right where his ribs were. Then she mimed breathing in, shallow and pained. Caleb frowned. "You think I'm sick?" She shook her head and pointed out the window, toward the barn. "One of the animals?" A nod. Caleb set down the flour sack and headed outside. In the barn, he found one of the younger cows lying on its side, breathing hard. Its eyes were glassy, and when he touched its flank, it was burning up. "Damn it," he muttered. He didn't know what was wrong with it, didn't know how to fix it. He'd lose the animal by morning if he didn't do something. Leora appeared beside him, the basket of herbs in her hands. She knelt down, pulled out several plants, and started crushing them between her palms. "What are you doing?" She didn't answer, just kept working, mixing the crushed leaves with water from the trough until it formed a thick paste. Then she spread it across the cow's chest and neck, her movements careful and deliberate. Caleb watched, skeptical. "That's not going to—" The cow's breathing slowed. Caleb stopped talking. Leora kept working, humming softly under her breath, that same low rhythmic sound she'd made during the birth. The cow's eyes began to clear. Its body stopped trembling. 15 minutes later, it was standing. Caleb stared. How? Leora wiped her hands on her dress and stood. She didn't look at him, just picked up the basket and walked back toward the house. Caleb stayed in the barn, staring at the cow, trying to wrap his mind around what he'd just seen. It wasn't possible. Animals didn't recover that fast. Fevers didn't break in minutes. Whatever had been wrong with that cow should have killed it. But Leora had fixed it, with plants and water and some kind of knowledge that shouldn't exist. Caleb's hands were shaking again. That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay on his bedroll near the fire, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of Leora's breathing from across the room. She was asleep, had been for hours, but Caleb's mind wouldn't stop turning. What was she? Not human, that much seemed clear. Or maybe she was human, but something more, something different. And what did that mean for him? For the ranch? For the town that was already starting to whisper? He turned onto his side, staring at the dying embers in the fireplace. He should have left her at that auction, should have walked away and bought a damn horse like he'd planned. But he hadn't, and now she was here, and he didn't know what to do about it. Mas. The next morning, Caleb woke to the smell of bread. Fresh bread. He sat up, confused. He didn't have the ingredients for bread, hadn't had flour for baking in weeks. But there it was, sitting on the table, still warm, next to a jar of honey he definitely didn't own. Leora was outside, hanging laundry. Caleb walked to the door and leaned against the frame, watching her. Where'd the honey come from? She pointed toward the hills again. You found a beehive? A nod. And you didn't get stung? She shook her head. Of course she didn't. Caleb sighed and went back inside. He cut a slice of the bread, spread honey on it, and took a bite. It was the best thing he'd tasted in years. He sat down at the table, eating slowly, trying to ignore the fact that his life had become completely incomprehensible. When Leora came back inside, he looked up at her. You don't have to do all this, you know. The cooking, the cleaning, whatever it is you do with the animals. She tilted her head. I'm just saying that I didn't bring you here to be a servant. You're free to leave anytime you want. She walked over to the table and sat down across from him. For a long moment, she just looked at him, studying him the way she always did. Then she reached out and touched his hand, not grabbing, not holding, just touching. And Caleb felt it again, that strange sense of understanding, like she was telling him something without words, that she wasn't here because she had to be. She was here because she wanted to be. Caleb swallowed hard. All right, he said quietly. All right. Kiss. 2 days later, a man showed up at the ranch. Caleb was fixing the fence on the west side when he saw the rider approaching. He straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead, and waited. The man who dismounted was middle-aged, dressed in a worn coat and a hat that had seen better days. He had the look of someone who'd spent his whole life working land that didn't want to be worked. Help you? Caleb asked. The man nodded. Name's Harlan. Got a farm about 10 miles south of here. I know who you are. Harlan shifted uncomfortably. Heard you got someone living with you. A girl. Caleb's jaw tightened. What about it? My daughter's been sick, real sick. Doctor doesn't know what's wrong with her. Tried everything. Nothing's working. I'm sorry to hear that, but I don't see what it has to do with me. Harlan looked down at his boots. Heard the girl knows things. Healing things. Caleb went very still. Where'd you hear that? Word travels. People talk. People should mind their own business. I know, Harlan said quickly. I know, and I wouldn't ask if I wasn't desperate. But my daughter, she's only 8 years old, and she's dying. Caleb stared at him. He wanted to say no. Wanted to tell this man to get back on his horse and leave. Because once people started coming here, started seeing what Leora could do, there'd be no stopping it. But the look in Harlan's eyes, Caleb had seen that look before, in the mirror. When his father was dying and there was nothing he could do about it. Wait here, Caleb said finally. He walked back to the house and found Leora inside, mending a torn shirt. There's a man outside, he said. His daughter's sick. He wants you to help her. Leora set down the shirt and looked at him. You don't have to, Caleb added. I can send him away. She stood and walked past him, out the door. Caleb followed. Harlan was still standing by the fence, hat in his hands. When he saw Leora, his expression shifted, part hope, part fear. This is her? He asked. Caleb nodded. Harlan looked at Leora. Please, I don't have much, but I'll pay whatever. Leora held up a hand, stopping him. Then she walked toward his horse. Harlan blinked. You'll come? She nodded. I'll go with you, Caleb said. Leora glanced at him, then shook her head. Leora, us. She placed a hand on his chest, the same gesture she always used when she wanted him to trust her. Caleb hesitated. Then he stepped back. Fine, but you come back before dark. She nodded. Harlan helped her onto his horse, and they rode off together, leaving Caleb standing alone in the yard. He watched them disappear over the ridge, a knot tightening in his chest. This was a mistake. He could feel it, but it was too late now. Leora didn't come back before dark. Caleb spent the evening pacing, checking the horizon every few minutes, trying to convince himself that everything was fine. But as the sun set and the sky turned deep purple, the knot in his chest grew tighter. What if something had happened to her? What if Harlan had figured out what she was and... Caleb stopped himself. He didn't even know what she was. But he knew people, and people didn't react well to things they couldn't explain. By the time the stars came out, Caleb was ready to saddle his horse and ride out looking for her. Then he saw movement on the horizon, a single rider, Leora. Caleb let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. She rode into the yard and slid off the horse, landing lightly on the ground. She looked tired, more tired than he'd ever seen her. You all right? He asked. She nodded. The girl? Another nod. Caleb wanted to ask more, wanted to know what she'd done, how she'd done it, but the exhaustion in her eyes stopped him. Come on, he said quietly. Let's get you inside. She followed him into the house, and he poured her a cup of water. She drank it slowly, her hands trembling slightly. Caleb sat down across from her. Did he pay you? She shook her head. Leora. She pulled something out of her pocket and set it on the table. A small carved wooden horse. Caleb picked it up. It was rough, clearly handmade, but detailed. The kind of thing a father might carve for his daughter. He gave you this? She nodded. Caleb turned it over in his hands. You should have asked for money. She just looked at him, and Caleb realized she didn't care about money. She'd helped that girl because she could, because it was the right thing to do, even if it cost her. He set the wooden horse down gently. You're too good for this world, you know that? Leora's lips twitched, almost a smile. Almost. Then she stood and went to bed. Caleb stayed at the table, staring at the wooden horse, and tried to ignore the feeling that everything was about to change. He was right. 3 days later, another person showed up, then another, then 2 more. Word had spread. Harlan's daughter had recovered, completely, miraculously, and now everyone wanted to know about the silent girl who could heal the sick. Caleb tried to turn them away, tried to tell them Leora wasn't a doctor, wasn't a miracle worker, wasn't whatever they thought she was. But they kept coming, and Leora kept helping them. A man with a broken leg that wouldn't set right. A woman whose baby wouldn't stop crying. An old rancher with a cough that had plagued him for years. One by one, they came. And one by one, Leora fixed them. Caleb watched it happen, helpless to stop it. Every time someone left, they looked at Leora with a mix of gratitude and fear, like they didn't know whether to thank her or run from her. And the more people she helped, the more the whispers grew. She's not natural. It's not right. Something's wrong with her. Caleb heard them, saw the way people looked at her when they thought she wasn't paying attention. And he knew. It was only a matter of time before fear turned into something worse. One evening, after the last visitor had left, Caleb found Leora sitting on the porch steps, staring out at the horizon. He sat down beside her. You need to stop. She glanced at him. I mean it, Leora. These people, they're grateful now, but they're scared too. And scared people do stupid things. She looked away. I'm not trying to tell you what to do, Caleb said quietly, But if you keep this up, they're going to turn on you. I've seen it before. Out here, people don't trust what they don't understand. Leora reached out and took his hand, not like before, gentle, reassuring. This time, her grip was tight, urgent. Caleb frowned. What? She pulled his hand to her chest, pressing it flat against her heart, and suddenly, Caleb felt it. Not words, not thoughts, but emotion. Raw, overwhelming. Loneliness. So deep it made his chest ache. She'd been alone for so long that helping people was the only thing that made her feel real, made her feel like she mattered, and if she stopped, she'd disappear again. Caleb's throat tightened. Leora. She let go of his hand and stood, walking back inside. Caleb stayed on the steps, staring out at the darkening sky. He understood now. She wasn't helping people because she wanted their gratitude. She was helping them because she needed to, because it was the only way she knew how to exist. And that scared him more than anything else. Because people like her, people who gave too much, always ended up getting hurt, and there wasn't a damn thing he could do to stop it. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. Caleb was in the barn, repairing a harness that had snapped the day before, when he heard voices outside. Not the usual sound of a single rider approaching. This was multiple people, talking low, urgent. He set down the leather strap and walked to the door. 5 men stood in his yard. He recognized all of them. Coulter and Boone from the general store, a rancher named Vickers who lived north of town, and 2 others, brothers named Sam and Thomas Webb, who ran a cattle operation on the far side of the valley. None of them looked friendly. Caleb stepped out into the sunlight, keeping his expression neutral. Something I can help you with? Coulter spoke first. We need to talk, Rourke. So talk. Not out here. Coulter glanced toward the house. She inside? Caleb's jaw tightened. What's this about? Vickers stepped forward. He was older than the others, gray-haired and weathered, with eyes that had seen too much and forgiven too little. There's been talk about the girl. There's always talk. This is different, Vickers said. People are saying she's doing things, unnatural things. She helps people. That's all. Helps them how? Sam Webb asked. His voice was sharp, accusatory. My cousin went to her last week, said she laid hands on his wife, whispered something he couldn't hear, and the woman's fever broke in minutes. Minutes, Rourke. That ain't normal. Caleb crossed his arms. Your cousin's wife is alive, isn't she? That's not the point. Then what is? Thomas Webb spoke up. He was younger than his brother, meaner. Point is, we don't know what she is, and we don't like mysteries. She's a girl, Caleb said flatly. That's all you need to know. Coulter shook his head. No, that's not all, because a girl doesn't do what she does. A girl doesn't know things before they happen, doesn't heal people with plants and touch. That's something else. You saying she's a witch? Caleb asked, his voice cold. The word hung in the air like smoke. No one answered, but the silence was answer enough. Caleb took a slow breath, fighting to keep his temper in check. You're all scared because you don't understand her. That's what this is. You'd rather call her dangerous than admit you don't know everything. We're not scared, Boone said, but his voice wavered. Yes, you are. Caleb stepped forward, and the men shifted uncomfortably. You're terrified because she makes you feel small, because she sees things you can't. And instead of being grateful for what she's done for this town, you're standing in my yard accusing her of, what, being different? Vickers held up a hand. Rourke, we're not here to fight. We're here because we're concerned, for the town, for our families. Then be concerned somewhere else. We can't do that, Coulter said. Not when there's a threat living right here. Caleb's fists clenched. She's not a threat. You don't know that. I know her better than any of you. Do you? Thomas Webb sneered. Or does she just have you fooled like everyone else? That did it. Caleb closed the distance between them in 2 strides and shoved Thomas hard enough to send him stumbling back. Get off my land, all of you. Now. Thomas recovered quickly, his face flushing red. You're making a mistake, Rourke. The mistake was letting you on my property in the first place. Coulter stepped between them, hands raised. All right. We'll go. But this isn't over. People have a right to know what's living among them. She's not living among you. Caleb said. She's living with me, on my land. And unless you've got a law saying otherwise, that's how it stays. The men exchanged glances. Then slowly, they started backing toward their horses. But Vickers paused before mounting. You're a good man, Rourke. Always have been. But good men make bad choices when they're too close to something. Think about that. Then they rode off, leaving Caleb standing alone in the yard, his heart pounding. He turned and saw Leora in the doorway. She'd heard everything. Caleb walked over to her, his jaw still tight. How much of that did you catch? She stepped aside to let him in, then closed the door behind him. They're scared, Caleb said, pacing the small room. Scared people are dangerous. We need to be careful. Leora touched his arm, stopping him. He looked down at her. I mean it. This isn't going away. They're going to keep pushing until something happens. She reached up and placed her hand against his cheek. Caleb went still. Her touch was gentle, steady, and for a moment all the anger drained out of him. I don't know how to protect you, he said quietly. She didn't need to answer. He could see it in her eyes. She wasn't asking him to. That night, Caleb couldn't sleep again. He lay on his bedroll staring at the ceiling, replaying the conversation in his head. The way Coulter had looked at the house, the way Thomas had sneered, the way Vickers had called him a good man, like it was a warning. They were planning something. He could feel it. Around midnight, he heard movement. Leora was sitting up in bed, looking at him. Can't sleep either? He asked. She shook her head. Caleb sat up, running a hand through his hair. I've been thinking, maybe we should leave, head west, start over somewhere no one knows us. Leora tilted her head. I know, Caleb said. I know you don't want to run. But staying here, it's not safe. Not anymore. She stood and walked over to him, sitting down on the floor beside his bedroll. For a long moment, they just sat there in the dim firelight, not speaking. Then Leora did something she'd never done before. She leaned her head against his shoulder. Caleb froze. It was such a small gesture, simple, human, but it meant everything because it wasn't about fear or survival or running away. It was about trust. She trusted him, and that scared him more than anything the town could throw at them. All right, he said quietly. We'll stay. But if things get worse, if they come back, we leave. Deal? She didn't move. Just stayed there, her head resting against him, her breathing slow and even. Caleb stared into the dying fire and wondered how the hell he'd ended up here. A month ago, he'd been alone, content, safe in his solitude. Now he had someone depending on him, someone he couldn't afford to lose. The next few days were tense. Caleb kept expecting the men to come back, kept watching the horizon for riders. But no one came. The town went quiet. Too quiet. It felt like waiting for a storm that hadn't arrived yet. Leora went about her work as usual, tending the garden, caring for the animals, cooking meals that somehow tasted better than anything Caleb had ever made. But there was a tension in her movements now, a wariness. She felt it too. On the fourth day, a woman showed up. She was young, maybe 25, with a baby strapped to her chest. She looked exhausted, desperate. Caleb met her at the fence. Ma'am. Are you Caleb Rourke? She asked. I am. I need to see the girl, the one who heals. Caleb hesitated. I don't think that's a good idea right now. Please. The woman's voice cracked. My baby's sick. The doctor says there's nothing he can do, but I heard she can help. Please. Caleb looked at the baby. Even from where he stood, he could see the child was pale. Too pale. Its breathing was shallow. Damn it! He glanced back at the house. Leora was already standing in the doorway watching. She walked over, barefoot as always, and stopped in front of the woman. The woman stared at her, hope and fear mixing in her eyes. Can you help him? Leora reached out slowly and touched the baby's forehead. The child whimpered. Leora closed her eyes, her hand resting gently on the small head. She stayed like that for a long moment, perfectly still. Then she opened her eyes and nodded. You can save him? The woman whispered. Another nod. Leora gestured for the woman to follow her inside. Caleb stayed outside, keeping watch. An hour later, the woman emerged, tears streaming down her face. But the baby in her arms was breathing easier. Color had returned to its cheeks. Thank you, the woman said, her voice shaking. Thank you so much. Leora just nodded. The woman reached into her pocket and pulled out a few coins. It's not much, but Leora shook her head and gently pushed the woman's hand back. Please, the woman said, let me give you something. But Leora was already walking back toward the house. The woman looked at Caleb, confused. She doesn't want payment, Caleb said quietly, but just take care of your son. The woman clutched the baby closer and nodded. Then she mounted her horse and rode away. Caleb watched her go, then turned back to the house. Leora was sitting at the table, her hands folded in her lap. She looked tired again, more tired than she should be. You can't keep doing this, Caleb said. She looked at him. Every time you help someone, it takes something out of you. I can see it. She didn't respond. Leora. He sat down across from her. I know you want to help. I know it matters to you. But you're burning yourself out. And for what? People who are too scared to even thank you properly? She reached across the table and took his hand. Caleb sighed. You're not going to stop, are you? She shook her head. Stubborn, he muttered. Her lips twitched, almost a smile again. Caleb squeezed her hand gently. Fine, but if you collapse, I'm not carrying you. She squeezed back. Liar, her eyes seemed to say, and she was right. 2 days later, everything fell apart. It started with a fire. Caleb woke in the middle of the night to the smell of smoke. He bolted upright, grabbing his boots and stumbling toward the door. Outside, the barn was burning. Flames climbed the walls, licking at the roof, sending sparks into the night sky. The horses were screaming inside. No, Caleb breathed. He ran toward the barn, but the heat drove him back. He could hear the animals panicking, could smell burning wood and hay. Leora appeared beside him, her face pale. Stay back, Caleb said. He grabbed a bucket, filled it from the trough, and threw it at the flames. It did nothing. He filled it again, threw it again. Nothing. The fire was too big, too fast. Leora touched his arm. I have to get them out, Caleb said desperately. She shook her head and pulled him back. Leora, they're going to die. She placed both hands on his chest and pushed him firmly away from the barn. Then she turned and walked straight toward the flames. Leora, no! But she didn't stop. She walked into the burning barn like she was walking through a doorway. Caleb's heart stopped. He started to follow, but the heat was unbearable. He couldn't breathe, couldn't see. Then he heard it, that humming, low, steady, cutting through the roar of the fire, and somehow, impossibly, the flames began to pull back, not extinguishing, just retreating, like they were being pushed away by something invisible. Caleb watched, stunned, as Leora emerged from the barn, leading the horses. All three of them, calm, unharmed. She walked them to the far side of the yard, then turned back toward the barn. The fire was still burning, but it hadn't spread, hadn't touched the house or the other buildings. It stayed contained, burning itself out slowly. Caleb stared at her. How did you... She swayed. He caught her before she hit the ground. Leora! He lowered her gently, checking for burns, but her skin was unmarked, untouched. She was just unconscious. Caleb carried her inside and laid her on the bed. Her breathing was shallow but steady. He pressed a hand to her forehead. She was cold, too cold. He covered her with every blanket he had and stayed beside her, watching her breathe, his own hands shaking. What the hell was she? And more importantly, who had started that fire? Leora didn't wake until morning. When she opened her eyes, Caleb was sitting beside the bed, still watching her. You scared the hell out of me, he said. She blinked slowly, disoriented. The barn's gone, but the horses are fine. You saved them. She tried to sit up, but Caleb gently pushed her back down. No, you're staying right there until you get your strength back. She frowned at him. Don't argue. For once, she didn't. Caleb stood and walked to the window, staring out at the charred remains of the barn. The fire had burned itself out completely, leaving nothing but blackened wood and ash. Someone set that fire, he said quietly. I checked this morning, found kerosene near the back wall. Leora's eyes widened. Yeah. Caleb's jaw tightened. They're done talking. Now they're taking action. He turned back to her. We're leaving, tonight. I'll pack what we can carry, and we'll head west. Find somewhere they've never heard of us. Leora sat up slowly and shook her head. Leora, she stood, swaying slightly, and walked over to him. She placed her hand over his heart again, and Caleb felt it. Not fear, not resignation. Resolve. She wasn't running. She was done hiding. They almost killed you, Caleb said, his voice rough. They'll try again. She nodded. And you're still not leaving? Another nod. Caleb stared at her, trying to understand. Why? Why stay here when they hate you, when they want you gone? She pressed her hand harder against his chest, and suddenly he understood. Because of him. She was staying because of him, because leaving meant leaving him behind, and she wasn't willing to do that. Caleb's throat tightened. You're an idiot, you know that? Her lips curved. A real smile this time. Small, but real. We're both idiots, Caleb muttered. He pulled her into a hug. Quick, awkward, but genuine. She stiffened for a moment, then relaxed against him. All right, Caleb said quietly. We stay. But we do this smart. No more helping strangers. No more taking risks. We keep our heads down and wait for this to blow over. Leora pulled back and looked at him. He sighed. I know. You're not going to stop helping people. She shook her head. Then I'm not leaving your side, understand? From now on, wherever you go, I go. She nodded. Good. Caleb stepped back. Now rest. You look like death. She made a face at him, the closest thing to humor he'd ever seen from her, and went back to bed. Caleb watched her settle in, then grabbed his rifle and went outside. If they were coming for her, they'd have to go through him first, and he'd make damn sure they regretted it. 3 days passed without incident. Caleb stayed close to the house, keeping watch. He slept in shifts, always with one eye open. Leora recovered slowly, though she still looked pale. Fragile. It made him angry all over again. On the 4th day, another visitor arrived. But this one was different. It was Harlan, the man whose daughter Leora had saved weeks ago. Caleb met him at the fence, rifle in hand. What do you want? Harlan raised his hands. I'm not here to cause trouble. Then why are you here? To warn you. Harlan glanced toward the house. There's going to be a meeting tonight, at the church. About the girl. Caleb's grip tightened on the rifle. What kind of meeting? The kind where they decide what to do about her. Harlan's expression was grim. Coulter and the others have been stirring people up, saying she's dangerous, saying she caused the drought last summer, the sickness that killed old man Patterson's wife. They're blaming her for everything. That's insane. I know, but people are scared, and scared people don't think straight. What are they planning? Harlan hesitated. I don't know for sure, but I heard talk of removing her, one way or another. Caleb's blood ran cold. They're going to kill her. I don't know, maybe. Or maybe they'll just try to run her out of town. Either way, you need to be ready. Why are you telling me this? Harlan met his eyes. Because she saved my daughter's life, and I'm not going to stand by and watch them hurt her for it. Caleb stared at him for a long moment. Then he lowered the rifle slightly. Thank you. Harlan nodded. Be careful, Rourke. These people, they're not thinking clearly, and that makes them dangerous. He turned his horse and rode off. Caleb stood there watching him go, his mind racing. A meeting, tonight. He had maybe 6 hours to figure out what to do. He went inside and found Leora kneading dough at the table. We have a problem, he said. She looked up. There's a meeting tonight in town about you. Harlan says they're planning something. Leora set down the dough, her expression calm. Too calm. Did you hear me? Caleb asked. They're coming for you. She nodded. And you're not worried? She shook her head. Caleb stared at her. Why not? She walked over to him and took his hands in hers. Then she pulled him toward the door. What are you doing? She didn't answer, just led him outside, across the yard to the top of a small rise that overlooked the valley. From here, Caleb could see for miles. The town in the distance, the scattered farms, the endless stretch of scrubland. Leora pointed at the town. Yeah, Caleb said. That's where they are. That's where they're going to decide. She shook her head and pointed again. Not at the town, at the people. And Caleb realized what she was trying to say. They weren't just a mob. They were individuals. People she'd helped, people she'd healed, people who owed her their lives. Not all of them would turn. Some of them would remember. "You think they'll stand up for you?" Caleb asked. She didn't answer, just looked at him with those sharp, knowing eyes. Caleb wanted to believe her, but he'd seen too much to have that kind of faith. "All right," he said quietly, "but I'm not taking any chances. Tonight, we're ready for anything." She squeezed his hands, and together they stood on that rise, watching the sun sink toward the horizon, waiting for the storm to break. The sun was setting when Caleb saw the riders, not one or two, at least a dozen, maybe more. They moved slowly across the valley floor, silhouettes against the dying light, heading straight for the ranch. Caleb's stomach dropped. "They're not waiting for the meeting," he said. Leora stood beside him on the porch, watching them come. Her face was unreadable, but her hands were clenched at her sides. Caleb went inside and grabbed his rifle. He checked the ammunition, his fingers moving automatically even though his mind was racing. 12 men. Maybe 15. All armed, all angry. This wasn't a conversation. This was a reckoning. He stepped back outside and positioned himself in front of the door. Leora moved to stand beside him, but he held out his arm, blocking her. "Stay behind me." She didn't move. "Leora, please." She looked at him for a long moment, then took one step back. Just one. It would have to be enough. The riders reached the fence and stopped. Caleb recognized most of them, Coulter and Boone in front, Vickers and the Webb brothers flanking them. The others were ranchers and farmhands, men whose faces he knew, but whose names he'd never bothered learning. Coulter dismounted first. The others followed. "Rourke," Coulter called out, "we need to talk." "Then talk from there," Caleb said, his voice steady. No need to come any closer. Coulter took a few steps forward anyway. "We had a meeting, took a vote. Town's decided that girl can't stay here anymore. The town doesn't get to decide what happens on my land. She's a threat," Boone said, stepping up beside Coulter. "People are scared. They want her gone." "Scared of what? A girl who's helped half of you?" "Helped?" Thomas Webb spat. "She's cursed us. Ever since she showed up, things have been wrong. Crops failing, animals dying, people getting sick." Caleb stared at him. "You're blaming her for a drought and bad luck?" "It's not luck," Sam Webb said. "It's her. She's doing it." "That's insane." "Is it?" Coulter's voice was cold. "How do you explain what she does, Rourke? The way she knows things before they happen? The way she heals people with nothing but a touch? That's not natural." "Maybe not," Caleb said. "But it's not evil either." Vickers stepped forward, his weathered face hard. "We're not here to debate. We're here to take her. Peacefully, if possible." Caleb raised the rifle. "Not happening." The men shifted, hands moving toward their own weapons. "Don't be stupid, Rourke," Coulter said. "There's 15 of us and one of you." "Then I guess I better make my shots count." Silence stretched between them, thick and dangerous. Then a voice spoke from behind the group. "You're going to have to go through me, too." Everyone turned. Harlan was riding up, his rifle resting across his saddle. He stopped beside the other men but didn't dismount. Coulter frowned. "Harlan, what are you doing?" "Same thing Rourke's doing, standing up for someone who doesn't deserve this." "She's dangerous. She saved my daughter's life," Harlan said flatly. "I'm not forgetting that just because you're scared." Another voice called out. "Me neither." A woman on horseback appeared from the direction of town. Caleb recognized her, the woman with the sick baby. She pulled up beside Harlan, her jaw set. "She healed my son when the doctor said there was nothing he could do. I won't let you hurt her." Coulter's face darkened. "This isn't your concern." "The hell it isn't." More riders appeared. 1, then 2, then 5 more. People Leora had helped, people who owed her. They formed a loose line between Coulter's group and the house, weapons drawn, expressions grim. Caleb's throat tightened. She'd been right. Not everyone had forgotten. Coulter looked around, his confidence wavering. "You're all making a mistake." "Maybe," Harlan said, "but it's ours to make." Vickers spoke up, his voice tired. "This isn't over, Rourke. Even if we leave now, the fear's still there. And fear doesn't go away just because a few people feel grateful." "Then I guess we'll deal with it when it comes back," Caleb said. The two groups stared at each other for a long, tense moment, Then Coulter spat into the dust and turned toward his horse. Let's go. What? Thomas Webb looked at him, incredulous. We came all this way. I said, let's go. The men hesitated, then slowly began mounting their horses. But the looks they gave Caleb and Leora were venomous, promising. This wasn't over. Caleb knew it. They all knew it. The hostile group rode off, disappearing into the gathering darkness. The others, Harlan and the woman and the rest, stayed a moment longer. Thank you, Caleb said. Harlan nodded. Don't thank us yet. This bought you time, but Vickers is right. The fear's still there. You need to figure out what you're going to do about it. I know. The woman with the baby rode closer. Is she all right? Caleb glanced back at Leora, who stood silent in the doorway. She's fine. Tell her we won't forget what she did. Caleb nodded. One by one, the others rode off, leaving Caleb and Leora alone in the yard. Caleb lowered the rifle, his hand shaking slightly. He turned to Leora. You knew they'd come, didn't you? She nodded. And you still stayed. Another nod. Caleb let out a long breath. You're going to get yourself killed. She stepped forward and placed her hand over his heart again. That same gesture, that same silent answer. Not without you. Caleb closed his eyes. We can't keep living like this. Always waiting for the next attack. Always looking over our shoulders. She pulled her hand away and walked past him, into the house. Caleb stood there for a moment, staring at the empty road, then followed her inside. That night, neither of them slept. Caleb sat by the window, rifle across his lap, watching the darkness for any sign of movement. Leora sat at the table, her hands folded, staring at nothing. Around midnight, she stood and walked over to him. Can't sleep either? Caleb asked. She shook her head and sat down on the floor beside his chair. They stayed like that for a while, silent, the only sound the crackling of the dying fire. Finally, Caleb spoke. I've been thinking. Maybe there's a way to fix this. Leora looked up at him. If people are scared because they don't understand you, maybe we show them. Maybe you explain what you do, how you do it, take away the mystery. She frowned. I know, Caleb said. You can't talk, but you can write. You can show them. She shook her head firmly. Why not? She stood and walked to the table. She picked up a piece of charcoal and began drawing on the wood surface. A circle. Then lines radiating out from it. Then more circles, connected by threads. Caleb came over and looked at the drawing. What is this? She tapped the center circle, then pointed at herself. You? She nodded. Then she pointed at the other circles and gestured around, at the house, the land, the distant town. Other people? Another nod. She traced the lines connecting them, her finger moving slowly, deliberately. You're saying you're connected to them? She tapped her chest, then the drawing, then gestured outward. And Caleb understood. She didn't just heal people, she felt them. Their pain, their fear, their sickness. It was all connected to her somehow, flowing through those invisible threads. And if she tried to explain that to people who were already terrified, they'd think you were even more dangerous, Caleb said quietly. She nodded. So there's no way to make them understand. She shook her head. Caleb sank into a chair, running his hands through his hair. Then what do we do? Leora knelt in front of him and took his hands in hers, and suddenly he felt it again. That rush of emotion. Not words, but pure feeling. She wasn't afraid. Not of the town, not of the men, not of what might happen. The only thing she feared was losing him. Caleb's chest tightened. I'm not going anywhere. She squeezed his hands. But we need a plan. We can't just wait for them to come back. She stood and walked to the window, staring out at the darkness. Then she turned back to him and made a decision. She pointed at herself, then at the door. You want to leave? Caleb asked. She shook her head. She pointed at herself again, then made a walking motion with her fingers, away from the house, toward the town. You want to go to them? A nod. Absolutely not. She gave him a look, steady, determined. Leora, they'll kill you. She shook her head. How do you know? She placed her hand over her heart, then pointed at the drawing on the table. The circles. The threads. She knew because she could feel them. could sense what they were going to do before they did it. Caleb stood. No, I'm not letting you walk into that town alone. She crossed her arms. I mean it, Leora. You're not doing this. She stared at him, unmoving. They stood there in the firelight, locked in a silent standoff. Finally, Caleb sighed. Fine, but I'm coming with you. She shook her head. Yes. Non-negotiable. If you're going, I'm going. She opened her mouth as if to argue, then closed it. She couldn't argue. She had no voice. Caleb crossed his arms, mirroring her stance. That's settled then. She glared at him. He almost smiled. You can be mad at me all you want. Doesn't change anything. She turned away, frustrated, but didn't push it further, because deep down, Caleb thought, she didn't want to go alone either. Dishak. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Caleb was feeding the horses when he heard the sound of a wagon approaching. He grabbed his rifle instinctively, then relaxed when he saw who it was. Reverend Mills sat in the driver's seat, with two women from the town beside him. One was the baker's wife, a stout woman named Martha. The other was younger, maybe 18, with nervous eyes and hands that wouldn't stay still. Mills climbed down slowly. He was older than Caleb had realized, his movements stiff. Mr. Rourke, Mills said. May we have a word? Caleb glanced at the house. Leora was watching from the window. What's this about? May we come in? It's a delicate matter. Caleb hesitated, then nodded. He led them inside where Leora stood waiting, arms crossed defensively. The young woman gasped when she saw Leora, then immediately looked away, embarrassed. Please, sit, Caleb said, though he remained standing. Mills settled into a chair with a grateful sigh. The women sat on either side of him, the young one still refusing to meet Leora's eyes. There's been talk, Mills began, as I'm sure you know, about what happened last night, about Coulter and his men coming here. Yeah, I know, Caleb said. Some in town think Coulter was right, that the girl should leave, but others, he paused, others think differently, and they sent us here. To say what? Martha spoke up, her voice gruff but not unkind. To apologize and to ask for help. Caleb frowned. Help with what? The young woman finally looked up. My sister, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She's been sick for 2 weeks. Doctor says it's pneumonia. Says she might not make it. Leora's expression softened. I know it's asking a lot, the girl continued, especially after what happened, but I heard what you did for others, and I thought, maybe, she trailed off, tears welling in her eyes. Mills looked at Leora. We understand if you refuse. After the way this town has treated you, you'd have every right. But this girl's sister is only 12 years old, and she's running out of time. Leora glanced at Caleb. He wanted to say no, wanted to tell them to leave and take their problems with them. After everything that had happened, they didn't deserve Leora's help. But when he looked at the young woman's desperate face, he couldn't do it. It's your choice, he said to Leora. She walked over to the girl and gently touched her shoulder. The girl looked up, hope flooding her features. Leora nodded. Thank you, the girl breathed. Thank you so much. Mills stood. We have a wagon outside. If you're willing, we can take you into town now. Caleb grabbed his coat. I'm coming too. Of course, Mills said. Mugged. The ride into town was tense. Caleb sat in the back of the wagon with Leora, his hand resting on his knife. He didn't trust this. Didn't trust that it wasn't some kind of trap. But Leora seemed calm, almost peaceful. When they reached the town, Caleb noticed immediately that something was different. The streets weren't empty like before. People were out, watching, waiting, but they weren't hostile. They looked uncertain, conflicted. The wagon stopped in front of a small house on the edge of town. The young woman, her name was Sarah, Caleb had learned, jumped out and hurried inside. Caleb helped Leora down, scanning the crowd that had started to gather. Stay close to the wagon, he muttered. She ignored him and walked toward the house. Inside, they found a small bedroom where a girl lay in bed, her breathing labored and wet. Her skin was pale, her lips tinged blue. The smell of sickness filled the air. Sarah's mother sat beside the bed, her face haggard. When she saw Leora, she stood quickly. You came, she said, her voice breaking. I didn't think you would. Leora approached the bed slowly, kneeling beside it. She placed her hand on the girl's forehead, then her chest, listening, feeling. The girl's eyes fluttered open. "Mama," she whispered. "Shh, sweetheart. There's someone here to help." Leora closed her eyes, her hand still resting on the girl's chest. Caleb watched from the doorway, aware of the crowd gathering outside, peering through windows and the open door. They were watching. All of them. Minutes passed. 5. 10. Then Leora began to hum. That same low rhythmic sound she'd made before. It filled the small room, seeming to vibrate through the walls. The girl's breathing began to change. Still labored, but steadier, more even. Leora reached into the small pouch she carried, the one filled with herbs and roots she'd gathered from the hills. She crushed something between her palms, mixed it with water from a cup beside the bed, and held it to the girl's lips. "Drink," she whispered. The girl's mother gasped. She spoke, but Caleb barely noticed. He was too focused on what was happening to the sick girl. Color was returning to her cheeks. Her breathing was easing. The blue tinge was fading from her lips. Leora stayed beside her for another 20 minutes, humming softly, her hands moving over the girl's chest and throat with careful precision. Finally, she stood. The girl was sleeping peacefully now, her breathing clear and strong. Sarah's mother stared at her daughter, then at Leora, then burst into tears. How did you?" Leora just shook her head and walked toward the door. Outside, the crowd had grown, easily 30 people now, all watching in silence. Caleb stepped out beside Leora, his hand moving to his knife. But no one moved. No one spoke. They just stared. Then, slowly, an old woman at the front of the crowd stepped forward. She was ancient, bent with age, but her eyes were sharp. "My grandson fell from a horse last month," she said. "Broke his leg. It healed wrong. He can't walk right anymore." She looked at Leora with a mixture of hope and fear. "Can you help him?" Before Leora could respond, another voice spoke up. "My wife's been having terrible headaches for months now. Doctor says there's nothing he can do." Another. "My son's been coughing up blood." Another. "My daughter can't hear out of her left ear." One by one, people began calling out their ailments, their problems, their desperate needs. Caleb moved closer to Leora, ready to pull her away if the crowd turned hostile. But they weren't hostile, they were pleading. Mills pushed through the crowd, holding up his hands. "Please, please, one at a time." He turned to Leora. "I know this is asking too much, but if you're willing, these people need help." Leora looked at Caleb. He wanted to say no, wanted to grab her and get her out of there before something went wrong. But he saw the look in her eyes. This was what she'd been waiting for. Not fear, not suspicion, but acceptance. People asking for her help, not because they were desperate, but because they believed she could give it. She turned back to Mills and nodded. "Thank you," Mills said quietly. Mopat. What followed was one of the longest days of Caleb's life. Leora went from house to house, treating whoever needed help. The old woman's grandson, the man with the coughing son, the woman whose daughter couldn't hear. She worked tirelessly, never stopping, never complaining, and Caleb stayed beside her the entire time, watching the crowd, watching for danger. But it never came. Instead, something else happened. People started helping. Women brought water and clean cloth. Men cleared spaces for Leora to work. Children ran errands, fetching herbs and supplies. The town that had threatened her just the night before was now working together to support her. It was surreal. By late afternoon, Leora had treated nearly 20 people. Some conditions were simple, infections, minor injuries. Others were more complex. But in every case, she did what she could. And in most cases, it worked. When the sun began to set, Mills approached Caleb. "She should rest," he said. "She's been at this for hours." Caleb nodded. He'd been thinking the same thing. Leora looked exhausted, her movements slower, her face pale. He touched her arm gently. "That's enough for today." She shook her head. "Leora, you're going to collapse." She pointed at the line of people still waiting. "They can wait until tomorrow." She frowned at him. "I'm serious. You're no good to anyone if you work yourself to death." Mills intervened. "Mr. Rourke is right. You've done more than enough for one day. The rest can wait." Leora looked at the waiting people, then back at Caleb. Finally, reluctantly, she nodded. Caleb felt relief wash over him. Come on, let's get you home. But before they could leave, Coulter appeared at the edge of the crowd. He looked different than he had the night before. Less certain, less angry. He walked forward slowly, stopping a few feet from Leora. The crowd went silent. I was wrong, Coulter said. His voice was rough, like the words hurt to say. About you. About what you are. Leora just watched him. I was scared, he continued. We all were. And fear. Fear makes people stupid, makes them cruel. He looked down at his boots. My daughter's been sick, same as the others. Fever that won't break, and I didn't want to ask you for help because I was too proud, too stubborn. He met her eyes. But I'm asking now, please, help her. Silence stretched between them. Caleb held his breath. This was the moment, the one that would determine everything. If Leora refused, no one would blame her. Coulter had tried to have her driven out, had burned Harlan's barn, had threatened her life. He deserved nothing from her. But Leora didn't refuse. She just nodded and gestured for him to lead the way. Coulter's shoulders sagged with relief. Thank you. Yes. Coulter's house was small and poorly maintained, with a roof that leaked and windows that didn't quite close. Inside, a girl of maybe 7 lay in bed, her skin flushed with fever, her breathing shallow. Coulter's wife sat beside her, her face drawn with exhaustion and fear. When she saw Leora, she stood quickly. Tom, what is she doing here? She's here to help Annie. But you said, I know what I said. I was wrong. His wife looked at Leora, then at her daughter, then back at Leora. Can you really help her? Leora knelt beside the bed without answering. She examined the girl carefully, her hands gentle but thorough. Then she reached into her pouch and began preparing a mixture. Caleb watched from the doorway, aware of Coulter standing beside him, tense and uncertain. I didn't mean for things to get so out of hand, Coulter said quietly. The fire at Harlan's place. That wasn't supposed to happen. Things just escalated. Yeah, they did, Caleb said, his voice hard. And people could have died. I know. Do you? Because it seems like you were fine with it until you needed something from her. Coulter's jaw tightened. I know I don't deserve this. No, she doesn't owe me anything, but she's helping anyway. That says something about her character. It says she's better than you. Yeah, Coulter said quietly. It does. Inside the room, Leora was humming again, the same low sound. The girl's breathing began to ease. An hour later, the fever broke. Coulter's wife wept openly, clutching her daughter's hand. Thank you. Thank you so much. Leora just stood and gathered her things. As she and Caleb headed for the door, Coulter stopped them. I'm sorry, he said, for everything. I'll make sure people know. I'll tell them they were wrong about you. Leora looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was acceptance. And for now, that was enough. They rode back to the ranch in silence. The moon was high and bright, painting the landscape in shades of silver. Caleb kept his arm around Leora's waist as she leaned against him, exhausted. You did good today, he said quietly. She didn't respond, just breathed. But you can't keep doing this every day. It's too much. She stirred slightly. I'm serious, Leora. You help people, and that's incredible. But you have to take care of yourself, too. She lifted her head and looked at him. I know you want to help everyone, Caleb said. But you're only one person, and if you burn yourself out, you won't be able to help anyone. She rested her head against his shoulder again. We'll figure it out, Caleb said. Some kind of schedule, some way to make this sustainable. She nodded slightly. When they reached the ranch, Caleb helped her down and led her inside. She went straight to bed, not even bothering to change, and was asleep almost immediately. Caleb sat by the fire, watching her sleep, his mind racing. Today had been a turning point. He could feel it. The town had seen what she could do, had seen her kindness, her willingness to help even those who'd tried to hurt her. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to change things. But Caleb knew better than to count on it. Fear was like a weed. You could cut it back, but it always grew again. And somewhere out there, someone would still be afraid, still be angry, still be looking for someone to blame. All they could do was be ready, and hoped that the good would outweigh the bad. As Caleb finally lay down to sleep, he glanced over at Leora one last time. She looked peaceful, almost happy. And for now, that was all that mattered. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. But tonight, they'd won. And sometimes, that was enough. The peace lasted exactly 4 days. On the 5th morning, Caleb woke to find Leora already up, standing at the window, staring toward the hills. Something about the way she stood, rigid, alert, made his stomach clench. "What is it?" he asked, pulling on his boots. She didn't turn around, just pointed. Caleb looked out and saw nothing at first. Then he caught it. A thin line of smoke rising from beyond the ridge. Too dark to be a campfire. Too steady to be an accident. "That's Harlan's place," Caleb said quietly. Leora's hands were shaking. Caleb grabbed his rifle and headed for the door. "Stay here." She caught his arm, shaking her head. "Leora, if this is what I think it is..." She gripped harder, her eyes fierce. She wasn't staying behind, not this time. Caleb hesitated, then nodded. "All right, but stay close." They rode hard toward Harlan's farm, the horse laboring under both their weights. The smoke grew thicker as they got closer, and by the time they crested the ridge, Caleb could see the flames. Harlan's barn was burning, just like Caleb's had. They found Harlan in the yard, trying to save what he could, while his wife corralled their daughter away from the fire. When he saw Caleb and Leora, his face twisted with anger and grief. "They came in the night," Harlan said, his voice raw. Didn't say a word, just poured kerosene and lit it up. "You see who?" Caleb asked. "Didn't have to see them. I know who it was." Harlan turned to Leora, and for a moment Caleb thought he might blame her too. But instead, Harlan's expression softened. "I'm sorry. I thought standing up for you would be enough. I didn't think they'd come after me." Leora stepped forward and placed her hand on his arm. Harlan let out a shaky breath. "I don't regret it. What I said in that church. I meant it. But my family..." "We'll fix this," Caleb said, though he had no idea how. Harlan shook his head. "Can't fix what's already burned." They stayed until the fire died down, then helped Harlan salvage what little remained. By the time they left, the sun was high and merciless, and Caleb's hands were black with soot. On the ride back, Leora was silent. But Caleb could feel the tension radiating from her like heat from a forge. This was her fault, she was thinking. Harlan had defended her, and now he was paying the price. "It's not your fault," Caleb said quietly. She didn't react. "Leora, look at me." She turned her head slightly. "This is on them, not you. You didn't set that fire. You didn't make them cruel. They chose this." She looked away again, but her shoulders remained tight. Caleb knew that look. She was planning something, and that scared him more than the fires ever could. But over the next 2 days, more incidents occurred. A fence cut on the property of the woman who'd brought her sick baby to Leora. Cattle let loose from the pens of a rancher who'd spoken up at the church. Windows broken at Martha's bakery in the middle of the night. Each attack was small, petty, but the message was clear. Stand with the girl, and you'll pay. The town began to fracture. Some doubled down on their support for Leora, defiant in the face of threats. Others grew quiet, fearful. A few openly turned against her again, deciding that safety was more important than gratitude. Caleb watched it happen with growing frustration. They'd won. The town had accepted her, and now Coulter and his followers were tearing it all apart through intimidation and fear. On the 3rd night after Harlan's barn burned, Caleb sat at the kitchen table, cleaning his rifle for the 4th time that day. His hands moved mechanically, but his mind was elsewhere. Leora sat across from him, mending a shirt, but her stitches were uneven, distracted. "We can't keep living like this," Caleb said finally. She set down the needle. "They're never going to stop. As long as you're here, as long as people support you, Coulter's going to keep attacking. Keep hurting anyone who stands up for you." Leora's jaw tightened. "I'm not saying you should leave," Caleb added quickly. "I'm saying we need to end this. Permanently." She looked at him, questioning. "I don't know how yet," he admitted, "but there has to be a way. Some way to make them understand that they can't keep doing this." Leora stood and walked to the window. She stared out into the darkness for a long time. Then she turned back to him, and he saw something in her eyes he'd never seen before. Not fear, not sadness, determination. She walked over to the table and picked up the piece of charcoal she'd used before. On the wood surface, she began to write. Slowly, carefully. I will go to them. Caleb's heart sank. No. She underlined the words. Leora, we talked about this. You can't just walk into town and... She held up her hand, stopping him. Then she kept writing. Not to fight, to show them. Show them what? She paused, searching for the right words. Then she wrote, Who I am, what I am. No more hiding. Caleb stared at the words. You want to... What? Demonstrate? Prove yourself? She nodded. And how exactly are you going to do that? She tapped her chest, then gestured outward. Then she made a sweeping motion with her hand, gathering, pulling in. Caleb frowned, trying to understand. You want to bring people together? Another nod. The ones who support you? She shook her head and made the gesture bigger. Everyone. Everyone? Including Coulter and the others who want you gone? Yes. That's insane. They'll never agree to it. She wrote again. They will if they need me. What do you mean? But Leora just shook her head. She couldn't explain it, not with words. Caleb leaned back in his chair, studying her. You're going to do something, aren't you? Something big. She met his eyes and nodded. And you're not going to tell me what it is. She shook her head. Caleb sighed heavily. You know I hate when you do this. Her lips twitched, almost a smile. Fine, he said. But whatever you're planning, I'm there. No arguments. She nodded, accepting that, because she knew there was no point in arguing. The next morning, Leora disappeared. Caleb woke to find her side of the bed empty. He checked the house, the yard, the barn. She was gone. Panic hit him like a fist to the chest. He saddled the horse and rode toward town, his mind racing through every terrible possibility, but he didn't find her on the road. Instead, he found her 3 miles outside of town, kneeling in the dirt near an old dried-up creek bed that hadn't held water in over a year. She had her hands pressed flat against the ground, her eyes closed, her whole body perfectly still. Caleb dismounted and approached carefully. Leora? She didn't respond. What are you doing out here? Still nothing. He knelt beside her. Leora, you're scaring me. Her eyes opened slowly. She looked at him, and he was struck by how distant she seemed, like part of her was somewhere else entirely. Are you all right? He asked. She nodded, but it wasn't convincing. What are you doing? She placed one hand on his chest, that familiar gesture, and with her other hand she pointed at the ground beneath them. Caleb frowned. The creek bed? What about it? She pressed harder on his chest, and suddenly he felt it. Not words, not images, but sensation. Water, cold and clean, flowing deep beneath the earth. Trapped. Waiting. Caleb's eyes widened. There's water down there? She nodded. How do you know? She tapped her head, then her chest. She could feel it, sense it the way she sensed everything else. And you think, what? You can bring it up? She nodded again. Leora, that creek's been dry for over a year. The whole region's in a drought. If there was water down there, someone would have found it by now. She just looked at him with those steady eyes. And Caleb realized she wasn't guessing. She knew. Even if you're right, he said carefully, even if there is water down there, how are you going to get to it? She stood and gestured for him to move back. Then she knelt again, placed both hands on the ground, and closed her eyes, and began to hum. That same low rhythmic sound. But this time it was different, deeper, more resonant. Caleb felt it in his chest, in his bones. The ground beneath them began to tremble, just slightly at first, then stronger. Leora. The humming grew louder, more intense. The earth cracked, not violently, but deliberately, like something was pushing up from below. And then Caleb saw it. Water, seeping up through the cracks in the dried creek bed. Slow at first, then faster. Within minutes, a small stream was flowing. Within an hour, the creek bed was half full. Caleb stared, his mouth dry. How? Leora swayed, and he caught her before she fell. You did it, he said, his voice full of awe. You actually did it? She was pale, exhausted, but there was a light in her eyes he'd never seen before. Pride. She'd done something impossible, and she'd done it to save these people, even the ones who hated her. Word spread fast. By midday, people had started gathering at the creek. First a few, then dozens. They came to see the miracle, the water that had appeared from nowhere, the drought that had been broken. And they came to see Liora. She sat on a rock beside the flowing water, still pale, still weak, while people stared and whispered. Caleb stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder, protective. Reverend Mills was one of the first to arrive. He stood at the edge of the creek, staring at the water, then at Liora. "How?" he asked simply. Liora just shook her head. "This is—" Mills struggled for words. "This is beyond anything I've ever seen." More people arrived. Harlan, Martha, the woman with the baby, even some who'd been hostile before. And then Coulter came. He rode up slowly, dismounted, and walked to the creek's edge. He stared at the water for a long time, his expression unreadable. Then he looked at Liora. "You did this?" She nodded. "Why?" She stood, wobbling slightly. Caleb steadied her. Then she pointed at Coulter, at the crowd, at the town in the distance. "For all of you." Coulter's jaw worked. "Even after everything we did to you?" She nodded. "Why?" he asked again, his voice rough. Liora picked up a stick and scratched words in the dirt. "Because you need it." Coulter stared at the words for a long time. Then he did something Caleb never expected. He got down on his knees. Right there, in front of everyone. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "For all of it. The things I said. The things I did. I was wrong. About you. About everything." Liora stepped forward and placed her hand on his head. Not like a blessing. Not like forgiveness. Just acknowledgement. Coulter looked up at her, tears streaming down his weathered face. "How do I make this right?" She pulled her hand away and wrote in the dirt again. "Help me, help them." "How?" She gestured to the crowd, to the town. "Tell them the truth." Coulter stood slowly. He turned to face the gathered people. "I've been a fool," he called out. "Worse than a fool. I let fear make me cruel, let pride make me blind. This girl, this woman, she's not a threat. She never was." He gestured to the water. "She could have left us to die of thirst, could have let our crops fail and our animals die. But she didn't. She saved us, even though we didn't deserve it." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. "I'm done fighting her," Coulter continued. "Done spreading fear. And anyone who wants to keep attacking her or the people who support her, you're going to have to go through me first." Silence. Then, slowly, Thomas Webb stepped forward. He looked different than before, smaller, ashamed. "He's right," Thomas said quietly. "We've been wrong, all of us." Sam Webb joined his brother, then Boone, then others who'd been part of Coulter's group. One by one, they acknowledged their mistakes, and one by one, they knelt. Liora watched them, her expression unreadable. Then she turned and started walking back toward the ranch. Caleb followed quickly. "Liora, wait." She stopped and looked at him. "That was incredible. What you did back there. You changed everything." She shook her head and pointed at her chest. "Just the beginning." "What do you mean?" She made that gathering gesture again, bigger this time, and Caleb understood. The water was just the first step. She wasn't done. Over the next 2 weeks, something remarkable happened. Liora didn't just heal people anymore. She taught them. She showed them which plants grew where and why. How to read the land, how to sense changes in weather before they came, how to understand animals, crops, water. She turned the ranch into a kind of school. People came from all over, not just the town, but from farms and settlements miles away. They came to learn from the girl who'd brought water from stone, and Caleb watched his solitary ranch transform into something he'd never imagined, a community. There were classes in the morning, Liora teaching groups of children how to identify medicinal herbs. In the afternoon, she worked with the adults, showing them techniques for crop rotation and water conservation. In the evening, people gathered to share meals, stories, knowledge. The ranch became a hub, a center, And Lyora became something more than a healer or a mystery. She became a teacher, a guide. Someone people looked to not out of fear or desperation, but out of respect. Caleb found himself swept up in it despite himself. He'd never been much of a teacher, never been patient enough, but he knew the land, knew ranching, knew how to survive in harsh conditions. So he taught too. He showed men how to repair equipment, how to build structures that would last. He taught boys how to handle horses, how to shoot straight, how to read the sky for storms. And slowly, without meaning to, he became part of something bigger than himself. One evening, as the last visitors left and the sun painted the sky orange and gold, Caleb found Lyora sitting on the porch steps, watching the horizon. He sat beside her. "Tired?" She nodded but smiled, a real smile. "This is what you wanted, isn't it?" Caleb asked. "Not just to be accepted, but to be useful, to have purpose." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "You've built something amazing here," he said quietly. "Something that's going to last." She lifted her head and looked at him. "What?" he asked. She took his hand and spelled out letters on his palm with her finger. W-E. "We?" Caleb repeated. She nodded firmly. "We built this." Caleb's throat tightened. "I just provided the space. You did the rest." She shook her head and spelled again. Y-O-U-S-A-W-M-E. The words hit him harder than they should have. "You saw me." Before anyone else. Before the town came around. Before the miracles and the teaching and the community. He'd seen her. And that had made all the difference. Caleb squeezed her hand. "Yeah, I guess I did." They sat in silence as the stars began to appear, one by one, filling the darkening sky. And Caleb thought about how far they'd come. From that dusty auction yard where a scared, silent girl had stood with a rope around her wrist, to this, to a ranch full of life and purpose and hope. It seemed impossible. But then again, so did everything about Lyora. Mshin. Winter came gradually that year. The first snow fell in early November, light and tentative. By December, the valley was blanketed in white. The visitors slowed but didn't stop completely. People still came seeking knowledge, seeking help, but the pace was gentler, more sustainable. Lyora had learned to pace herself, to rest, to let others help carry the burden. She'd also started speaking more, not constantly. Her voice was still rough, still uncertain, but she used it when it mattered. She spoke to teach, to comfort, to guide. And every time Caleb heard her voice, it sent a jolt through him, because it meant she was choosing to be heard, choosing to exist in a way she'd never allowed herself before. One particularly cold evening, with snow falling heavy outside and the fire crackling warm inside, Caleb and Lyora sat together at the table, planning for spring. "We'll need more space," Caleb said, sketching rough plans on paper. "If people keep coming like this, the house and barn won't be enough." Lyora nodded, studying the drawings. "I was thinking we could build a meeting hall, something bigger, where you could teach larger groups." She touched the paper, then wrote beside his sketch, "Garden 2, for growing teaching plants." "Good idea," Caleb said. "We'll need help building it all, but I think people will volunteer." She smiled. "They will." Caleb looked at her. "You're sure about this? About making this a permanent thing?" She met his eyes and nodded firmly. "It's a lot of work," he warned. "A lot of responsibility." "I know," she said aloud. The words were quiet but clear. "And you're okay with that?" "Yes." She reached across the table and took his hand. "Are you?" Caleb considered. A year ago, he would have said no. Would have run from this kind of commitment, this kind of community. But now? "Yeah," he said. "I am." She squeezed his hand, and they went back to planning. Bolshik. Spring arrived with a fury of green and life. The snow melted, the creek Lyora had awakened ran strong, and the land burst into bloom. Construction began on the meeting hall in March. True to Caleb's prediction, dozens of people showed up to help. Men from town, ranchers from the surrounding area, even some of Coulter's former followers. They worked together, sawing and hammering and building something that would last. Coulter himself came almost every day, working harder than anyone. He'd changed since that day at the creek, become quieter, more thoughtful. One afternoon he approached Caleb while they were taking a water break. Can I ask you something? Coulter said. Go ahead. How do you do it? Live with her? With someone who can do what she does? Caleb wiped sweat from his forehead. What do you mean? I mean, doesn't it scare you? Knowing she can see things, know things you don't? Caleb looked over to where Leora was teaching a group of children how to plant seeds. At first, yeah, it terrified me, but then I realized something. What? She could have used that power to control people, to manipulate them, to take advantage. Caleb turned back to Coulter. But she never did. She used it to help, to heal, and that tells you who she really is. Coulter nodded slowly. I wish I'd understood that sooner. You understand it now. That's what matters. They went back to work. By May, the meeting hall was finished. It was simple but sturdy, with windows that let in light and a stove that would keep it warm in winter. The whole community gathered for the opening. Mills said a few words. Harlan spoke about how much the place meant to everyone. Martha brought food, more food than they could possibly eat. And Leora stood at the front, quiet and small, and spoke to the crowd. Thank you, she said, her voice stronger now but still soft, for giving me a home, for letting me help, for teaching me that being different doesn't mean being alone. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. After the ceremony, as people celebrated and ate and talked, Caleb pulled Leora aside. You did good, he said. She smiled. We did good. Yeah, he agreed. We did. Summer brought its own challenges. A family showed up from 2 territories over, having heard about Leora and traveled for weeks to find her. Their son had a condition the doctors couldn't identify, seizures that came without warning and left him weak for days. Leora worked with the boy for 3 weeks, trying different herbs, different techniques. Some days there was progress, others setbacks. It was frustrating, exhausting, and it reminded Caleb that Leora wasn't infallible. She couldn't save everyone, couldn't fix everything, but she tried. That was what mattered. By the end of the 3rd week, the seizures had reduced in frequency and severity, not gone, but manageable. The family wept with gratitude, but Leora wouldn't accept their thanks. I didn't cure him, she said quietly, just helped him live with it. That's more than anyone else could do, the father said. After they left, Caleb found Leora sitting alone by the creek, staring at the water. You okay? He asked. I wanted to fix him completely, she said. Make him better. You did make him better, just not perfect. It's not enough. Caleb sat beside her. Leora, you can't save everyone. You can't fix every problem. Nobody can. Then what's the point? The point, Caleb said gently, is that you try. That you do what you can. That boy's life is better because of you. That's enough. She looked at him, doubt still in her eyes. I'm serious, he continued. You've helped hundreds of people, changed this whole community, brought water to a dying land. That's more than most people accomplish in a lifetime. But nothing. You're human, Leora, not a miracle worker, just a person with a gift, and sometimes gifts have limits. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly. You're right. I usually am, he said with a slight smile. She elbowed him gently, and he laughed. They sat by the creek until the stars came out, talking about nothing and everything, and Caleb realized something. This was happiness, not perfection, not a life without problems or pain, but moments like this, connection, understanding, being with someone who saw you completely and stayed anyway. That was enough. More than enough. Fall arrived with golden light and cool winds. The community had grown beyond anything Caleb could have imagined. The meeting hall was in constant use. The teaching gardens were thriving. People came from farther and farther away, seeking Leora's knowledge. And through it all, she remained humble, grounded. She still worked the ranch with Caleb, still cooked meals and mended clothes and fed the animals. She hadn't forgotten where she came from. One October evening, as they worked together to repair a section of fence, Caleb brought up something that had been on his mind for weeks. I've been thinking, he said, hammering a nail into wood. About what? Leora asked, holding the board steady. About us. She looked at him, curious. About making this official. Official how? Caleb set down the hammer. I want to marry you. Leora's eyes widened. I know it's not traditional, he continued quickly. I know we've already been living together, building a life together. But I want everyone to know, want it to be real in every way. It already is real, she said softly. I know, but he struggled for words. I want to stand in front of everyone and say that I choose you, that I'll keep choosing you every day. Leora's eyes filled with tears. Is that a yes? Caleb asked nervously. She laughed, a sound he still heard too rarely, and nodded. Yes. He pulled her into a hug and she clung to him, both of them grinning like fools. They were married a month later in the meeting hall they'd built together. The whole community came. Mills performed the ceremony. Martha made a cake that could have fed twice as many people. Children ran around laughing while adults danced and celebrated. It wasn't fancy. There were no expensive decorations or elaborate clothes, but it was perfect. Because it was theirs. When Mills asked Caleb if he took Leora as his wife, Caleb said, I do, without hesitation. And when Mills asked Leora the same question, she looked at Caleb with those sharp, knowing eyes and said clearly, I do. The crowd erupted in cheers, and as Caleb kissed his wife for the first time as husband and wife, he thought about the journey that had brought them here. From that auction yard to this moment, from fear and misunderstanding to love and acceptance. It had been hard, messy, imperfect, but it had been worth every second. Years passed. The community continued to grow and thrive. The meeting hall expanded. More teachers joined Leora, people she'd trained who could help share the work. Children who'd learned from her grew up and began teaching their own children. The ranch became a legacy. Caleb and Leora grew older together. Gray appeared in Caleb's hair, lines formed around Leora's eyes. But they were happy. Some mornings, Caleb would wake early and find Leora already outside, watching the sunrise with that same quiet intensity she'd had the day they met. He'd join her, and they'd stand in silence, holding hands, watching the world wake up. Those moments were his favorite. Not the celebrations or the accomplishments, but the quiet times, the simple presence of someone who understood him completely. One spring morning, when Leora was teaching a group of young students in the garden, Caleb watched from the porch. She was patient with them, showing them how to identify plants, how to feel the life in the soil, how to listen to what the land was telling them. She'd found her calling, her purpose, and she'd given him one too. Not through words or demands, but through example. She'd shown him that a life spent in service to others wasn't a burden. It was a gift. Harlan walked up beside him, older now, his daughter grown and teaching alongside Leora. She's something, isn't she? Harlan said. Yeah, Caleb agreed. She really is. You ever regret it? Buying her that day? Caleb smiled. Not once. Even with all the trouble? All the fear and fighting? Especially because of that, Caleb said. The trouble showed us who we really were, what we were capable of, both the good and the bad. Harlan nodded. We're better for having known her. We're better for having listened to her, Caleb corrected, for giving her a chance instead of letting fear win. They stood in comfortable silence, watching Leora work. You know what I think? Harlan said after a while. What? I think she saved us, not just from sickness or drought, but from ourselves, from our own worst instincts. Caleb considered that. Maybe. Or maybe we saved each other. Gats. On a warm evening in late summer, many years after that first auction, Caleb and Leora sat on their porch, watching the sun set over the valley they'd transformed. The land was green and thriving. The creek ran strong. Voices drifted from the meeting hall where a class was still in session. Do you ever miss it? Caleb asked. The quiet? When it was just you and me? Leora thought about it. Sometimes, she admitted, but I wouldn't trade this. Me neither. She leaned against him. You know what I think about? What? That day, at the auction, when you bought me. Caleb winced. I hate thinking about it like that. Like I bought you. You did, though, she said matter-of-factly. But you also saw me, not as property, not as a mystery or a threat, just as a person who needed help. You needed a lot more than help. She smiled. So did you. Yeah, he admitted. I guess I did. We healed each other, she said softly. That's what I think. I helped your body, but you helped my soul. Caleb turned to look at her. That's the most poetic thing you've ever said. She laughed. Don't get used to it. They sat in silence as the stars began to appear, and Caleb thought about what they'd built. Not just the buildings or the community or the programs, but something more fundamental. A place where being different wasn't something to fear. Where understanding mattered more than conformity. Where people took care of each other not because they had to, but because they wanted to. It wasn't perfect. There were still disagreements, still problems, still moments of fear and doubt. But that was okay, because perfection had never been the goal. The goal was connection, growth. Learning to live with uncertainty and still choose kindness. And they'd achieved that. Not through grand gestures or miracles, but through small choices made every day to see each other, to listen, to try. I love you, Caleb said suddenly. Leora looked at him, surprised. He didn't say it often, wasn't the type. I love you too, she said. I mean it. Everything we've built, everything we've done, none of it would have happened if you hadn't been brave enough to stay, to keep trying even when people treated you terribly. You were brave too, she said. You stood up for me when no one else would, because it was the right thing to do. Exactly, she smiled. That's what I'm saying. You did the right thing, even when it was hard, even when it put you in danger. That's real bravery. Caleb shook his head. I was terrified most of the time. So was I, but we did it anyway. Yeah, he said. We did. As the night deepened and the air grew cool, they went inside. But Caleb paused at the door, looking back at the valley one more time. Somewhere out there, he thought, there were other people like Leora. Other people who were different, misunderstood, afraid. And maybe, just maybe, there were other people like him. People who could choose to see past their fear, to offer help instead of judgment, to build something better. It was a nice thought, a hopeful one. And as he closed the door and followed Leora inside, Caleb allowed himself to believe it, because if they could do it here, in this harsh, unforgiving valley, anyone could. The story of Caleb and Leora wasn't about miracles or magic. It was about something simpler and more profound. It was about a man who learned to open his heart, and a woman who learned to use her voice. It was about a community that chose understanding over fear. And in the end, that was the greatest miracle of all. Not the water from stone or the impossible healings, but the simple act of people choosing to be better, to each other, to themselves, to the world. And that choice, made over and over again, day after day, year after year, that was what changed everything.